The metallic taste of fear never truly leaves your mouth once you've tasted it. Marcus Thompson learned this truth at 5:47 a.m. on the 15th of October, 2021, when his radio crackled to life with words that would forever divide his life into before and after. All units, respond to DIA runway 34L. We have a Boeing 737 down, multiple casualties expected. The coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering against the kitchen floor of his modest ranch house in Aurora. 8-year-old Emma stirred in her bedroom down the hall, and for a moment, Marcus considered the luxury of staying home, of keeping this day ordinary. But his pager was already buzzing with the insistence of emergency, and 23 years of emergency medical training had programmed his body to respond before his mind could object. As he kissed Emma's sleeping forehead and whispered instructions to Mrs. Rodriguez next door, Marcus had no idea he was stepping into a story that would rewrite everything he thought he knew about fate, love, and the mysterious ways trauma can become transformation. The drive to Denver International Airport stretched ahead like a prayer he didn't know how to finish. His partner Jake was unusually quiet in the passenger seat, both men understanding that plane crashes weren't like car accidents or house fires. The scale was different. The stakes were absolute. In his 12 years as a paramedic, Marcus had worked hundreds of emergencies, but aviation disasters carried a weight that settled into your bones and stayed there. "You ever work a plane crash before?" Jake asked, his voice carefully neutral. Marcus shook his head. "You? Once? In Phoenix before I moved here. Took me 6 months to sleep through the night again." Jake's confession hung between them like smoke. The thing about plane crashes is that everyone thinks about the people who don't make it, but sometimes the ones who survive, they got their own hell to walk through. Neither man could have predicted how prophetic those words would prove to be. The scene at runway 34L looked like something from a disaster movie, except the acrid smell of jet fuel and burning rubber was achingly real. Flight 447 had been carrying 147 passengers and crew from Seattle to Denver when hydraulic failure sent the aircraft into an uncontrolled landing that became a 2,000-foot slide across concrete and grass. The Boeing 737 had finally come to rest in 3 distinct sections, each presenting its own maze of twisted metal and human need. Marcus had trained for this moment his entire career, but no amount of preparation could have equipped him for the symphony of sounds that greeted him as he approached the wreckage, metal groaning under its own weight, the distant wail of sirens converging from every direction, the voices of survivors calling for help, calling for family members, calling for anyone who could make sense of the senseless. But it was the silence that got to him most. The pockets of absolute quiet where people were too hurt to make noise, too shocked to cry, too busy staying alive to waste energy on sound. Those silences pulled at him like gravity, demanding his attention, his skills, his presence. The forward section of the plane had taken the worst of it. Marcus moved through the debris field with practiced efficiency, his trained eyes constantly assessing, categorizing, prioritizing. Green tag for minor injuries, yellow for serious but stable, red for critical, black for the ones who were beyond help. It was a system designed to save the maximum number of lives, but systems don't account for the human heart, and Marcus felt each black tag like a personal failure. That's when he found her. Sarah Chen was trapped in what had been row 12, the business class section that was now a chaotic puzzle of seats, luggage, and ceiling panels. A piece of overhead compartment had pinned her left leg, and blood from a head wound had dried in dark streaks down her face. Her gray business suit was torn and stained, but her eyes were clear and focused with the kind of determination that Marcus recognized in himself, the refusal to surrender even when everything around you suggested surrender was the logical choice. "Ma'am, I'm Marcus with Denver EMS. Can you tell me your name?" His voice carried the calm authority of someone who had learned to be steady when the world was shaking. Sarah Chen. Her voice was surprisingly strong despite the circumstances. "Is everyone else okay? I heard screaming, but then it stopped, and I don't know if that's good or bad." Even trapped and bleeding, her first concern was for others. Marcus had been doing this job long enough to recognize something rare when he saw it genuine care that extended beyond self-preservation. It was a quality he'd tried to teach Emma, and seeing it in a stranger during her worst moment felt like witnessing something sacred. "We're taking care of everyone," he assured her while carefully examining the debris that had her pinned. "Right now, I need to focus on taking care of you. Can you feel your legs?" Sarah's attempt to move sent a sharp intake of breath through her teeth. "The left one feels like it's on fire, but I can move my toes." That's good, right? Marcus smiled despite himself. Most people in her situation would be screaming or unconscious. Sarah was trying to diagnose her own injuries. That's very good. You're going to be fine, but we need to get you out of here safely. I'm going to call for some equipment, and then we're going to take our time doing this right. What should have been a 15-minute extraction stretched into nearly an hour. The piece of debris pinning Sarah's leg was wedged against structural elements that couldn't be moved without risking further collapse. Every few minutes, Marcus had to leave her side to attend to other victims, but something kept pulling him back to row 12, to the woman who asked about everyone else's welfare while blood dripped steadily from her forehead onto her ruined laptop. "You don't have to keep coming back to check on me," Sarah said during one of his returns. "I know there are people who need you more." Marcus knelt beside her and looked directly into her eyes. "Right now, you're exactly where I need to be." It was unprofessional. It violated every protocol about emotional attachment and resource allocation that had been drilled into him since his first day of training. But something about Sarah's quiet strength in the face of chaos reminded him of Emma's resilience after her mother died, of his own determination to keep going when everything felt impossible. The extraction finally succeeded with the help of specialized cutting equipment and 3 other paramedics. As they carefully loaded Sarah onto a backboard, she reached out and grabbed Marcus's hand with surprising strength. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know why you stayed with me, but thank you." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "You're going to be okay, I promise." It was a promise that haunted him for weeks afterward. In emergency medicine, you don't make promises. You can't guarantee outcomes or predict recoveries. But something about Sarah had made him want to believe in certainty again, to offer the kind of assurance he wished someone could have given him the night Emma's mother died. The ride to Presbyterian, St. Joseph Hospital was a blur of vitals and radio communications, but Marcus found himself memorizing details about Sarah that had nothing to do with her medical condition. The way she asked about the flight crew's condition, the fact that her torn laptop bag contained presentations for a children's literacy nonprofit alongside corporate marketing materials. The small scar on her chin that looked like it had a story behind it. "You're married?" she asked as they pulled into the hospital bay, nodding toward his wedding ring. Marcus glanced down at the band he still wore 3 years after Emma's mother died. "Widowed. I have a daughter." Sarah's expression softened with understanding. "I'm sorry. How old is she?" 8. Her name's Emma." Marcus wasn't sure why he was sharing personal details with a patient, but the usual boundaries felt strangely irrelevant. "Emma's a beautiful name. She's lucky to have a dad who saves people." As they wheeled Sarah into the emergency department, Marcus realized he'd broken his own cardinal rule about emotional investment. But for the first time in years, breaking the rules felt like the right thing to do. The weeks following the crash blurred together like frames in a damaged film reel. The investigation, the media attention, the commendations that felt hollow when he thought about the people who hadn't made it home. Marcus threw himself into work with even more intensity than usual, picking up extra shifts and volunteering for the most difficult calls. Emma noticed the change, commenting one evening that Daddy seemed more sad than usual. But it wasn't just sadness that was eating at him. It was the knowledge that somewhere in the city, Sarah Chen was fighting battles he couldn't help with. He'd heard through hospital contacts that her recovery was complicated post-concussion syndrome, memory issues, and a shattered tibia that required multiple surgeries. Her high-powered marketing career at Pinnacle Communications had evaporated when she couldn't handle the cognitive demands of her previous role. The professional distance he'd maintained for 12 years had cracked that day in the wreckage, and now Marcus found himself doing something he'd never done before, following up on a patient's long-term outcome. He told himself it was professional curiosity, but Emma's increasingly pointed questions about the airplane lady suggested his 8-year-old daughter could see through his rationalizations better than he could. "Did you save her, Daddy?" Emma asked one evening as he tucked her into bed. "I helped her, sweetheart, but sometimes saving someone takes a long time, and lots of different people have to help." Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "Maybe she needs a friend too. You always tell me that friends help each other get better." 3 months after the crash, Marcus discovered that Emma's wisdom was about to be tested in ways none of them could have anticipated. He was shopping for groceries at the King Soopers on Colfax when he saw her. Sarah was standing in the pharmacy section, staring at a bottle of prescription medication with the kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones and changes the way you carry yourself. Gone was the determined businesswoman from the wreckage. In her place stood someone who looked like she was barely keeping her head above water. "Sarah?" His voice was gentler than he'd intended, careful not to startle her. She turned, and for a moment, Recognition flickered across features that looked thinner than he remembered. Marcus, the paramedic. A smile ghosted across her lips. I never got to properly thank you. What he'd intended as a brief pleasantry stretched into an hour-long conversation in the store's cafe area. Sarah's story unfolded like a medical case study in how trauma ripples outward in ways that never make the evening news. The concussion had left her with chronic headaches and memory gaps that made her previous job impossible. Her insurance company was fighting her disability claim, insisting that her injuries weren't severe enough for long-term support. Her boyfriend of 2 years had quietly disappeared when it became clear that her recovery wasn't going to be quick or convenient. The worst part isn't the physical stuff, Sarah confided, absently touching the scar on her forehead. It's how invisible the rest of it is. People see that I can walk and talk, so they assume I'm fine. But my brain feels like someone scrambled it and put it back together wrong. Marcus had heard variations of this story from other trauma survivors, but hearing it from Sarah felt personal, in a way that professional distance couldn't buffer. How are you managing? Sarah's laugh held no humor. Some days better than others. I'm learning that managing looks different than I thought it would. The conversation that followed revealed layers of struggle that Marcus recognized from his own journey through loss. The well-meaning friends who offered advice about getting back to normal without understanding that normal had been destroyed. The medical appointments that focused on physical healing while ignoring the psychological wreckage. The peculiar loneliness of surviving something that others could never fully understand. I keep thinking about something you said in the ambulance, Sarah admitted. You promised I was going to be okay. I've been trying to figure out if you were right. Marcus felt the weight of that promise, like a stone in his chest. What do you think? I think maybe okay doesn't mean what I used to think it meant. Maybe it's not about going back to who I was before. Maybe it's about figuring out who I am now. Their coffee had grown cold during their conversation, but neither seemed to notice. For the first time in months, Marcus found himself talking to someone who understood that healing wasn't linear, that strength sometimes looked like falling apart in productive ways, that survival was a daily choice rather than a one-time event. When they finally parted ways, Sarah hesitated by her car. Would it be completely inappropriate if I asked you to have dinner sometime? Not a date, she added quickly. I'm nowhere near ready for that, but maybe. Friendship? I haven't talked to anyone in months who didn't want to fix me or dismiss me. Marcus thought about Emma's advice about friends helping each other get better. I'd like that. Fair warning, though I come with an 8-year-old who's been asking about you since the day of the crash. Sarah's first real smile in months lit up her entire face. I'd love to meet Emma. If she's anything like her father, she's probably pretty amazing. Their first dinner together was supposed to be a casual meal at a family restaurant near Marcus's house. Instead, it became a 3-hour conversation that ranged from Emma's school projects to Sarah's attempts to figure out what came next in her career, to the strange guilt that both adults carried about surviving trauma when others hadn't. Emma, initially shy around the woman she'd only known as the airplane lady, quickly warmed to Sarah's genuine interest in her drawings, her opinions about everything from breakfast cereals to playground politics, and her detailed explanations of why her stuffed elephant Mr. Peanuts was the best listener in the family. Emma's right about Mr. Peanuts, Sarah told Marcus later as they watched his daughter demonstrate the proper way to have a tea party. Good listeners are harder to find than you'd think. What began as friendship deepened gradually, carefully, like two people who had learned that life could change in an instant and wanted to savor whatever stability they could build together. Marcus found himself looking forward to Sarah's texts, their long walks through Washington Park while Emma rode her bike ahead of them, the quiet evenings when Sarah would help with homework while he cooked dinner. Sarah discovered that healing looked different in the context of family life. Emma's uncomplicated acceptance of her headache days and memory lapses provided a form of grace that medical professionals and former colleagues had never offered. Marcus's patient presence during her worst moments reminded her that strength didn't always require independence. But the real transformation began when Sarah's frustration with the insurance system and lack of support for crash survivors sparked an idea that would change everything. What if we created something different? She asked Marcus one evening as they cleaned up after dinner. Emma was in the living room, supposedly doing homework but actually teaching Mr. Peanuts the alphabet. What if there was a place where people like me could get the support they actually need instead of what some insurance manual says they should need? Marcus looked up from loading the dishwasher. What would that look like? Sarah's marketing mind, dormant for months, suddenly came alive. I don't know yet, but I know what it wouldn't look like. It wouldn't be clinical. It wouldn't treat trauma like a problem to be solved. instead of an experience to be integrated, and it wouldn't leave people to figure it out alone. That conversation in Marcus's kitchen became the seed of something neither of them could have imagined during those first desperate moments in the wreckage. Sarah's understanding of trauma, combined with Marcus's connections in the emergency services community and his insights into the long-term effects of repeated exposure to crisis, created a vision for support that addressed the whole person rather than just their symptoms. They started small. Sarah used her savings to rent a tiny office space in a strip mall on South Broadway. Marcus spread the word through his network of paramedics, firefighters, and police officers about a new kind of support group that welcomed both trauma survivors and the first responders who had helped them. Emma contributed by drawing welcoming signs and helping arrange chairs in circles instead of clinical rows. The first meeting of what would become Second Chance's foundation attracted 7 people, 2 crash survivors, 3 first responders dealing with PTSD, and 2 family members who were struggling to support their traumatized loved ones. They sat in Sarah's borrowed folding chairs and talked about the things that traditional therapy sessions often missed: the anniversary reactions that came without warning, the strange guilt of surviving when others didn't, the way trauma changed your relationship with time and safety and trust. "This feels different," said Jennifer Walsh, a trauma surgeon who had worked on several crash victims and found herself unable to sleep for weeks afterward. "It doesn't feel like I'm being fixed. It feels like I'm being seen." Dr. Walsh's presence brought unexpected credibility to their informal gatherings. Her medical expertise, combined with her personal experience of trauma-related burnout, attracted other healthcare professionals who were struggling with the psychological costs of their life-saving work. Within 6 months, their weekly meetings had grown to over 30 regular participants, and a waiting list of people seeking the kind of peer support that traditional mental health services couldn't provide. Sarah found herself naturally facilitating discussions, her marketing background translating surprisingly well to group dynamics and program development. Marcus discovered that his crisis response training made him effective at recognizing when someone was struggling and connecting them with appropriate resources. Emma became their unofficial ambassador, greeting newcomers with the kind of unfiltered warmth that reminded everyone why they were fighting to heal. But the real breakthrough came when Boeing Corporation reached out through their community relations department. "We've been following your work," explained Jennifer Martinez, Boeing's Director of Community Impact, during a phone call that left Sarah speechless. "We're interested in partnering with organizations that support aviation accident survivors. Would you be willing to meet with our team?" Sarah's initial reaction was complicated anger. The company whose aircraft had destroyed her old life now wanted to help fund her new one? The irony felt almost insulting. But Marcus reminded her of something she'd learned in their support groups. Sometimes the people who cause the pain are the ones who need to be part of the healing. The meeting with Boeing's community relations team led to a partnership that surprised everyone involved. The corporation was genuinely interested in understanding the long-term psychological impact of aviation accidents, not just for liability purposes, but to develop better support protocols for future incidents. Sarah's unique perspective as both a crash survivor and a program developer provided insights that their corporate consultants had missed. The Boeing partnership provided funding for Second Chance's Foundation to expand beyond their strip mall office into a proper facility with multiple meeting rooms, a crisis intervention hotline, and a small staff of trained peer counselors. More importantly, it validated their approach in ways that opened doors to partnerships with hospitals, emergency services departments, and other trauma-focused organizations. Dr. Walsh officially joined as their medical advisor, bringing evidence-based practices to complement their peer support approach. Her presence attracted other healthcare professionals who were dealing with compassion, fatigue, and secondary trauma. The Foundation's Healing Circles program began bringing together everyone who had been involved in specific traumatic event survivors, first responders, medical professionals, and family members to process their experiences collectively rather than in isolation. The results were remarkable. Traditional trauma therapy focuses on individual healing, but Healing Circles recognized that trauma is often a shared experience that requires collective processing. Participants reported feeling less isolated, more understood, and better equipped to integrate their traumatic experiences into ongoing life narratives. Emma, now 11 and wise beyond her years, had her own insights about the Foundation's success. "I think it works because everyone gets to be both the helper and the person who needs help," she explained to a reporter who was writing a feature story about their family. "Dad always told me that helping people makes you feel better, but I think it's more than that. I think it makes you feel real." The video of Emma's interview went viral within days. Her articulate explanation of mutual aid and community healing resonating with viewers who were hungry for alternatives to individualistic approaches to mental health. Major news outlets picked up the story, and suddenly everyone wanted to know about the crash survivor, the paramedic, and the little girl who were revolutionizing trauma support. The attention brought opportunities that none of them had anticipated. A major hospital system in Chicago offered to pilot their Healing Circles program. A tech company donated software and equipment to help them track long-term outcomes and connect with participants remotely. Universities began studying their model as an alternative to traditional trauma intervention. But perhaps most importantly, the national attention brought them into contact with other grassroots organizations that were developing innovative approaches to community healing. They discovered a network of people who were creating alternatives to traditional mental health services veteran support groups, led by combat survivors, domestic violence programs developed by survivors, addiction recovery communities that focused on mutual aid rather than expert intervention. Sarah found herself traveling around the country, consulting with organizations that wanted to adapt their model for different types of trauma. Her presentations at conferences and workshops drew standing ovations from audiences who were hungry for approaches that honored both individual healing and collective resilience. Marcus continued working as a paramedic, but now he also trained other first responders on trauma recognition and self-care. His insights about the psychological costs of repeatedly witnessing human suffering filled a gap in emergency services training that had been ignored for too long. Departments that implemented his protocols reported significant decreases in PTSD rates and job turnover among their personnel. The Foundation's crisis hotline, staffed entirely by trained peer counselors who were themselves trauma survivors, operated 24/7 across 12 states. Their success rate was unprecedented. 94% of people who completed their year-long support program reported significant improvement in their ability to manage trauma symptoms and rebuild meaningful lives. 3 years after that first conversation in the grocery store, Marcus and Sarah were married in a ceremony that looked like a celebration of community healing. 200 crash survivors, first responders, medical professionals, and family members gathered in Washington Park to witness their vows. Emma served as maid of honor, delivering a speech that moved the entire gathering to tears. "When the airplane broke, it seemed like everything was broken," Emma said, standing confidently at the microphone. "But broken things don't have to stay broken. Sometimes they get put back together in ways that are even better than they were before. That's what happened to my family, and that's what happens in our foundation every day." The wedding photos showed 3 people who looked genuinely happy, but they also captured something deeper: the quiet confidence that comes from discovering that your worst experiences can become your greatest contributions to the world. But their story was far from over. Because real miracles don't just change the people they happen to, they create ripple effects that continue expanding long after the initial event. 6 months after their wedding, Sarah received a call that would take their work in directions none of them had imagined. It was from Dr. Michael Rodriguez at the Centers for Disease Control, who had been following their research on community-based trauma intervention. "We want to fund a national study of your model, Doctor," Rodriguez explained. "The preliminary data suggests that peer-led trauma support might be more effective than traditional clinical interventions for certain populations. If we can prove that scientifically, it could change how we approach mental health care in this country." The CDC study would follow 2,000 participants across 50 different sites over 5 years, comparing outcomes between traditional therapy, medication-based treatment, and the Second Chances Foundation's peer support model. It was the kind of research that could validate alternative approaches to mental health care and provide evidence for policy changes at the federal level. Sarah found herself testifying before congressional committees about the need for trauma-informed community mental health funding. Marcus was invited to speak at international conferences about first responder wellness and peer support programs. Emma, now 12, started her own blog about growing up in a healing family that attracted readers from around the world. But their most important work continued to happen in the quiet moments, late-night crisis calls, support group meetings where people shared their deepest fears and greatest hopes, one-on-one conversations with people who were learning to rebuild their lives from the ground up. "The miracle isn't that we survived the crash," Sarah reflected during a recent interview. "The miracle is that we learned to transform our survival into service, our pain into purpose, our individual healing into collective transformation." Marcus, holding Emma's hand as they walked through the same park where they'd had so many conversations about healing and hope, added his own perspective. I used to think that saving people meant pulling them out of burning cars or crashed planes. Now I know that sometimes saving people means showing them how to save each other. Emma, wise beyond her years and confident in ways that spoke to the security of being raised by people who had learned to transform trauma into strength, offered the final word. I think the best part about our story is that it's not really about us anymore. It's about everyone who finds out they can turn their broken parts into helping parts. The Second Chances Foundation now operates in 43 states, has helped over 15,000 people process traumatic experiences, and has trained more than 3,000 peer counselors. Their model has been adapted for everything from mass shooting response to natural disaster recovery to supporting families affected by medical trauma. But for Marcus, Sarah, and Emma, the numbers matter less than the individual stories. The firefighter who learned to sleep through the night again, the car accident survivor who discovered she could help other people navigate insurance battles, the emergency room nurse who found ways to process compassion fatigue that actually worked. Their kitchen table still serves as an informal headquarters for planning new programs and supporting people in crisis. Emma still helps stuff envelopes and greet visitors, though now she also maintains the foundation's social media presence with the kind of authentic voice that comes from growing up surrounded by people who have learned to be genuinely vulnerable and courageously hopeful. The crash that brought Marcus and Sarah together happened over 4 years ago, but its impact continues to ripple outward in ways that touch thousands of lives. They've learned that trauma doesn't have to be the end of anyone's story, it can be the beginning of a completely different kind of life, one built on the understanding that our worst experiences can become our greatest gifts to each other. The deepest truth about miracles isn't that they rescue us from our pain, it's that they teach us to transform our pain into purpose, our survival into service, and our second chances into stepping stones for others who are still finding their way out of their own wreckage. In a world that often feels broken beyond repair, the most radical act of hope is believing that our scars can become the roadmap for someone else's healing journey. The miracle isn't avoiding the crash, it's discovering that even in the wreckage, love finds a way to build something beautiful, something useful, something that makes the survival of everyone it touches a little more possible.